Hey everyone, this week was all about the macro data, namely inflation. Some of the Fed speakers came out downplaying the worries, but the market is adjusting to the idea of higher for longer interest rates yet again. Inflation is starting to look like a concern again, and we can't help but wonder whether the concerns are valid. We also got sentiment data that showed inflation expectations for the year ahead have gone up. All things considered, there are reasons to be worried because where we are seeing a spike in inflation is in services, more specifically, core services, which is what the Fed is also worried about. Having said that, food inflation is also increasing, and we're seeing spikes in food prices across the board. Egg prices, for example, have gone up significantly, with prices up close to 75% for the month. On a more serious note, though, the most glaring number in the CPI report was the increase in shelter inflation. Month on month, shelter inflation went up from 0.4% to 0.6% per month. Now that seems like a small number, but shelter constitutes 36% of the CPI inflation number, which is the largest part. If we break it down, overall inflation came down to 3.1%, but missed expectations. Core CPI, which is ex food and energy, stayed the same at 3.9% and also missed expectations. Now, the biggest reason was shelter inflation, which came down to 6% year on year. CPI excluding shelter was only 1.5%. That shows you how much of an effect shelter has. Now the biggest question is, where could we go from here? One way to look at this is by looking at home prices. We did some research and found that shelter inflation moves with the Case-Shiller Home Price Index, with a 12 to 15 month lag. So we took the chart and put in that lag, which shows that both home prices and shelter inflation have peaked for this cycle. Now the problem is, inflation hasn't been coming down fast enough. And then when we look at it further, we can see that home prices have started to rise again, which means inflation may pick up again by mid-2024. The second way to look at this is rent. We know that almost 27% of shelter CPI is made up of what is called owner's equivalent rent, OER for short. And this is an odd indicator because it tracks what homeowners would charge to rent their homes. Now, regardless of the oddity though, the bigger problem is that the indicator tends to lag real-time data by about 6 months or so. So when we look at leading indicators of rent from various other measures, we should be seeing rent inflation come down far more drastically. But that's not happening. Nevertheless, the real-time rent measures now seem to be bottoming, which means, once again, we could see rent inflation rebound between April and July. Now, what's going on with housing? There are two problems here. Firstly, home inventory is low, which means the US doesn't have enough homes. Secondly, people are not moving out of their existing homes because they have locked in low mortgage rates. It would seem, with the Fed hiking, that higher mortgage rates have had somewhat of a contradictory effect on the housing market. But recent data suggests that this is changing and the inventory of homes are increasing again. But the fact remains that more housing is required. This is why the home builder stocks have been on fire, because there continues to be a shortage of homes and plenty of business for them. We track all these data points closely at MacroVisor. So if you'd like to stay updated, please consider subscribing to our newsletter. We'll be watching the data closely, so stay tuned for more updates.